Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming back. Welcome one more time and good morning. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, writers, columnists, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, anybody with a thoughtful perspective. We want to package it up and bring it unedited and unaltered directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us today is our privilege to have E. Donald Elliott from Yale Law School. He's a professor of law. E. Donald Elliott has been a professor at Yale Law since 1981 and now teaches at the Scalia Law School. He teaches and writes in a wide variety of subjects, including constitutional law, civil procedure, administrative law, and energy and environmental law. He's also practiced law in Washington, D.C. for over 30 years with several leading firms. He's an elected member of the American Law Institute, the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and the Senior Fellow of the Administrative Conference of the United States. He also served as general counsel to the EPA 1981 to 1991. Oh, wow, 1991. E. Donald Elliott is the Florence Rogatz Visiting Professor of Law at Yale Law School. He is a leading academic scholar as well as practitioner in the fields of administrative environmental law. He's one of the most well-known, well-regarded environmental law professors in the nation, according to John Cruden, former president of the Environmental Law Institute and Assistant Attorney General. He's been teaching at Yale Law since 1981, from 2013 through 2020. He was also co-chair of the Environmental Practice Group at Covington and Burlington LLP in Washington, D.C. He was also serving as an assistant administrator, general counsel of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 1993. I think that's during Clinton. He was named...
No, it's Bush.
Oh, Bush. Okay, Bush. He was named to the first endowed chair in environmental law and policy at any major American law school, the Julian and Virginia Cornell Chair in Environmental Law and Litigation at Yale Law School from 2003 to 2009. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences on environmental studies and toxicology, which advises the federal government on environmental issues. He's served as a consultant on improving the relationship of law and science to the Federal Courts Study Committee, which was chartered by Congress to make recommendations for improving the federal courts, and to the Carnegie Commission for Law, Science, and Government. He co-chaired the National Environmental Policy Institute's Committee on Improving Science at the EPA. I think I got some. He's also writes a regular column and current events at the American Spectator and has published op-eds in many leading newspapers. He was named one of the top 25 environmental attorneys in the United States by National Law Journal and is highly ranked in Chambers USA leading lawyers for business, best lawyers in USA, DC super lawyers, and who's who in American law and who's who in the world. And these are some of the articles I found with the professor, but we'll get to that in a minute. And this is a new one. Can't show you the text, but that's the title of it. But first, let's check in. Professor, did I get anything wrong? Do we need to correct anything?
No, not at all. My father would have been very proud, and my mother would believe it.
Awesome. Okay. I know we talked a little bit, and originally I had found this 2019 article, I think, in the American Spectator, but you're talking about how this article, we can't show the text, but I could ask you about it. Why Biden should pardon Trump, time to stop the madness before it escalates. What is this article about, and why is this the most relevant article of the series that you've written? You've written roughly, I think this will be your third one. I think you said you wrote one in 2019, then there was another one. Why is this the most relevant one? Why is this the one to focus on at this particular moment?
Well, I'm not sure that it is the most important one. It's just really there's really a three-part series, and I started really worrying about the potential breakup of the U.S. in the article in 2019, and then I expanded on that. By comparison to Lincoln and the Civil War in the 2021 article. I'm not in favor of our going our separate ways. I think staying together as a country is in everybody's interest. It's what we law professors call a positive sum game. We all benefit from staying together. But I am concerned that our politics is really sort of spiraling out of control, and it's become kind of a blood sport. I think the events of January 6th indicate that. And I think that the prosecutions or the attempted or the pending prosecutions of Donald Trump really just escalate the matter. And in the forthcoming article, which I hope will appear in the Spectator within the next couple of days, um, I call on President Biden to do the wise and statesmanlike thing of pardoning Trump so that we can put this behind us. I think that people are not really thinking through um, what the potential reaction of Trump supporters would be if the prosecution, air quotes, succeeded. Um, and I think this has all the earmarks of a potential uncontrolled escalation. We've thought for many years about the possibility of a nuclear war that nobody wants when both sides miscalculate and don't accurately anticipate the actions of the other. And I see that same kind of thing happening in our politics now. I mean, it's fine for one side to satisfy their bloodlust, and I have written criticizing Trump. I'm not defending Trump's actions, particularly on January 6th, and in fact, I've written articles disapproving of it.
Right.
But I do think that these potential prosecutions are weak and really focus on technical violations, the mishandling of classified documents, the supposed mischaracterization of the payment to the porn star. I haven't yet seen the evidence. It hasn't yet come out about Trump's role on January 6th. But the idea of a government putting the leader of the opposition party in jail is something that I never really anticipated could happen in America. And I think that people have got to take a deep breath and think about, do we really want to go there? And in the forthcoming article, I envision a scenario, not that I'm advocating it, but I'm really fearing it, in which in which Governor DeSantis gives Trump a safe harbor in Florida, and either the state of New York or the federal government sends in agents to seize him forcefully. And would Florida react with counterforce? I mean, there are lots and lots of scenarios of what can happen, and none of them really are good in my view. So I think that Biden should follow the example of President Gerald Ford, who pardoned Richard Nixon. And I think that was a very successful and statesmanlike action, because it really put all of the divisive issues from the Watergate era behind us. And I understand that for political reasons, many people believe that Trump would be the easiest to beat, and they'd like to see him be the nominee for the Republicans. But I think both sides are playing with fire, and I just urge them to step back from the precipice. I think human beings, I've written elsewhere that I think the fundamental tragedy of human beings is that we can envision the future, but we're not very good at predicting it. And I'm very concerned that neither side is accurately predicting where this thing might lead.
Okay, well, let's start unpacking that. Are you saying it's really that bad? And I'm asking because this is to get your opinion out. It's really that bad that, if the federal government goes and arrests Trump, we might be looking at a situation socially, politically, that's not able to be contained. People get too mad at that point and they just can't be calmed down. Are we really that polarized as a country at this point?
Well, I don't know. One of the things I say in the article is, let's say it's only a 5% chance. Is it really worth taking? I mean, I think you got to look not only at the probability of an event, but what the magnitude of it being. The expected value is probability times magnitude. And I think we're really playing with fire here. I think we saw on January 6th, and whether you call it a riot or an insurrection, it was a very serious event that it was never anticipated or never, nothing like that had ever happened in American history before. And I think that one of the things I say in the article is if you think through this situation, I think January 6th could seem like child's play compared to what might happen if Trump continues to be the leading Republican nominee and the Biden administration is, quote, again, air quotes, successful in an attempt to put him in jail. I mean, the notion that you put your leading political opponent in jail is not the is not the American way, and I think that we should let the American people decide this at the ballot box in 2024, and I think the attempts by either side to weaponize the Department of Justice and the criminal process is the most disturbing event that has happened in my lifetime, with the possible exception of the McCarthy era. And I think it's even worse than the McCarthy era because Senator McCarthy was not in control of the apparatus of government. So I think it is time for cooler heads to prevail. And one of the problems I think with a special counsel investigation is that it's kind of like a nuclear missile. Once it's been launched, it's very difficult to turn it around or abort it.
Right.
I think that Jack Smith will, the special counsel will do his job and pursue Trump. And I'm really just asking people to think carefully what they wish for. There's the old expression, be careful what you wish for, you might get it.
Right.
And I think if there were convictions of Trump and an attempt to actually send him to federal prison, I don't know how Trump supporters would react, but I don't think it's frivolous to imagine that there might be potential violence, and I also don't think it's beyond the pale to imagine that Republican leadership in various states might attempt to defend him. And I think all of this raises the most serious threat to law and order since George Wallace stood in the door of the schoolyard
to block the federal troops.
And Eisenhower had to send federal troops into Little Rock when I was a child. So I don't think this is the kind of thing we should be playing with for political reasons on either side. And the only way that I can see to step back and calm things down is to pardon Trump. I think that Democrats are always going to believe that he committed crimes. Many people are going to defend his actions. And I think whether he should be reinstated to the presidency is an issue to be decided at the ballot box and not in court.
Joseph Biden has some popularity issues, especially after Afghanistan and inflation, et cetera. When Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, up until that point, as I understand from history books, he had a relatively good relationship with the American people. But the moment he pardoned Nixon, they all thought, well, you're in on it too. And that really hurt his political reputation. How can Biden do this and not have his political reputation slammed like President Ford did? Especially now, given that, I mean, I'm in California. Liberals almost universally hate Trump as if he's like an existential Satan. How much blowback is Biden going to get? And is it going to be too much for him to even retain his office?
Yeah, great question. And I think it goes fundamentally to the nature of law. You're going to forgive me for being a little academic about this.
No.
The key difference is that Biden is of the opposite political party. And Ford was, after all, Nixon's vice president. And so, as you said, there was a suspicion that he was in on the deal. fundamentally, the way in which a constitutional republic is maintained um, is when the opposition party accepts things with which they do not agree. One of the things that I say in the 2019 article that I'm glad I said is the idea of living together in a country depends upon people being willing to live in the same country with people with whom they fundamentally disagree. Although I said it in a little bit more pungent way,
Sure.
the people that they think are assholes, and
I've heard
you know,
versions of this. I've heard versions of this. Yes.
but
Tolerant.
there's a very wonderful book. It's not a bestseller. It's by an Oxford professor named Charles McIlwain. He published in 1954 about the beginnings of constitutional law. And he argues, I think, very persuasively that the idea of a constitution begins when the king disagrees with his barons, but goes along with their judgment anyway. I mean, there's no big deal when the king follows what his advisors are telling him to do when he agrees with it. What holds us together as a country or as a constitution is, as Voltaire said, I disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
That's my guy.
And I think that what we need now is someone to rise above the temporary political fray and the back and forth, and act in the best interests of the country. And I one of the things I said in the 2021 article is I hope those that are pushing divisive issues will consider the potential consequences to the country and whether or not the issue in question is sufficiently important to really risk a breakup. I wasn't advocating a breakup, although some people have misread, I think, the article that way.
No, I get it.
I was actually warning against it. And
I totally get it.
And I think now, that was very general, but I think this process of trying to put Trump in jail is a very specific and unnecessary provocation. I don't know the facts yet about what the issues surrounding the election or will be, but what I've read in the press is that the basis for charges is basically either obstruction of justice or defrauding the United States or whatever. These are potential legal claims, but I think that it would be wiser to cut some slack about a disappointed candidate challenging the election. And I would note that every Democrat who's lost a presidential election in recent years has also claimed that there was fraud or reasons that the results were. And Al Gore took that issue. Yeah, that Al Gore took that issue to the Supreme Court, which decided 5-4 along party lines. And then I think wisely, Gore put the good of the country above his own personal ambitions.
I agree.
I mean, he could have said, he could have denounced the Supreme Court decision as illegitimate because it was 5-4 along party lines. The Supreme Court tried very hard to make it unanimous. They tried to send it back to the Florida Supreme Court, which was heavily populated by Democrats, and asked them to reconsider their decision. Had they done that, I think that the election would not have been nearly as disputed. Again, it illustrates that how the opposition party behaves is really the key factor. The fact that people who like Trump is no big deal. And some people have speculated that Trump will negotiate a plea bargain, and as part of dropping the charges, he'll agree not to run in 2024. I think that would be terrible. I think that would only encourage people to use the political process. And look, I've served in government and I practiced law in Washington for many, many years. A great many people, former presidents, and other officers take classified documents with them to write their memoirs. It's not appropriate. I think we've seen that both Pence and Biden did something similar.
Yep.
And what this case against Trump is about is that when the government asked for them back, he negotiated by essentially refusing to give some of them back, and supposedly his lawyers represented that they'd all been sent back when they hadn't been. These are potential charges, but I don't think that they are sufficiently serious that from the standpoint of history, it will be worth the cost in terms of the potential unraveling of the American experiment. And the first article is about what Ben Franklin said when leaving the Constitutional Convention, and he was asked, "What have you given us?" And he said, "A republic, as long as you can keep it."
Right.
And I think this is really the most serious threat to maintaining a reasonable degree of civility and common interest in our country that has occurred in my lifetime. I contrast the situation in Washington today with the situation that took place under Lyndon Baines Johnson or under George Herbert Walker Bush, where we didn't agree, but we had civility and we all thought that we were working together to try to do what was best for the country as a whole. And I think that politics has become a blood sport in which lots of people see their careers ruined. I've known a number of people who have had their careers ruined simply because they were willing to try to serve their country in one administration or another. So I think that the prosecutions of Trump are indicative. They're the most serious, but I think they're symptoms of a much deeper breakdown of trust in the country. And if we don't do something about that, so look, I can't really predict how Democrats might react if Biden were to pardon Trump.
That's what I wanted to ask you.
I think I could write a good. I think I could write a good speech for him. I think I could write a good speech for him about why he was doing it, and I think he's in a position where the Democrats really don't have anywhere else to go.
Right.
So
right.
I mean, there may be this third party candidate, but
good point.
I can't imagine people voting for. I can't imagine left wing Democrats who would be the most upset voting for Joe Manchin or Ron DeSantis because Biden pardoned Trump. So I don't really see him as having a big risk. And I do think that he would go down in history as a great man if he had the wisdom to do something like that. This is bad now, and it's only going to get worse between now and November 2024 if this thing continues. So somebody's got to put a stop to it. And I can't figure out a way to put a stop to it other than to have Biden pardon Trump. So that's why I'm advocating that.
I get it. Just a couple of points I remember years ago learning about. I think his name was Thomas More, and he was one of the first people in medieval times in Europe to challenge the king. And he wrote a book called Utopia, and that was the basis of all law in the Western world. Was this book, and the idea was you have a set of rules that everybody agrees to. King, that makes sense. But it has to be rules for everybody. And the thing that gets me is They also, and the concept there is that if you have laws that are unjust and the people know are unjust, they will not follow those laws. And then you will have breakdown of order. So you have to have laws that everybody gets are just. So they believe that that's what the law should be. And when you have the FBI raid Donald Trump's house in Mar-a-Lago, TV cameras, helicopters, everything. Oh man, bad dude. And then you find out later that President Biden also has secret documents at more locations than Trump. Oh, but the difference is he didn't argue with the prosecution, but Trump did. Okay, but it looks bad for the president, and I understand he goes, I didn't authorize this. I don't buy that at all. For the president to authorize an FBI raid on a house for the same thing he did. Although he didn't argue, he had many more locations. And I believe one of them was at one of his Penn centers, which is partially funded by the Chinese government. Not a good look at all. Secondly, I remember the Mar-a-Lago raid. Merrick Garland comes out. Biden and Pelosi will say absolutely nothing the day after the raid. People are freaking out. They're talking about civil war after Mar-a-Lago. Again, I'm not condoning that. I'm just talking about the day after the raid, the night of the raid. People are freaking out. Republicans are going nuts. Biden and Pelosi have nothing to say for days. No word, no leadership. Merrick Garland gets on TV and goes, I did everything perfect for myself. Don't look at me. So at the most difficult, tumultuous, explosive moment in American history recently, president can't say nothing. Speaker of the House can't say nothing. Attorney General can't say nothing. American public are supposed to just sit and stew in it. And they did. And then it got worse. So I found a total lack of leadership over that event. Even if you felt that Trump should have been charged and raided, boy, did they not handle that well. They just didn't provide any leadership, no calming down, no explaining to the American people. People were allowed to think the wildest, craziest theories for days and just let it rile up. Yeah, you add on top of that, I could see that goes really bad. Because we're violating the concept that built all our law in Europe. You have to have laws that everyone agrees are fair. You cannot have laws and go, well, that applies to that side, but I think it's against me.
Well, I agree with a lot of that. There's some of it I don't agree with, but I have a lot of regard for Merrick Garland, who I've known for many years. But I do agree with you that you can't wash your hands of this. This reminds me a little bit of Pontius Pilate washing his hands and letting the crowd go ahead and execute Jesus. I think, and the other thing is, I think it's even worse than what you said, because it goes back to claims for many years by members of the Congress that President Trump was a Russian agent.
I was going to ask.
And when the idea originally came out of he was withholding classified documents, it was announced as violations of the Espionage Act, and many people that I know thought, oh, they finally proved that Trump was a spy for the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there need to be some limits to what is considered to be permissible in American politics, and I think that we've sunk to some pretty low levels. I do know enough history to know that there have been periods in American history when politics got as nasty as it's now getting, including even breaking out of fistfights on the floor of the Congress. But I often point out to people that those divisions ended in a civil war in which 600,000 people were killed. And proportionally, I understand that would be like 40 million people being killed in today's population.
Yeah, thank you.
So, I think people have got to be cognizant of their acts. And, you mentioned Thomas More. I think it's worth remembering how he died. The king said, won't somebody free me of this wretched priest? And the guy went out and killed him. So I think that's an illustration of how things can spiral out of control and that people in power have to carefully weigh their actions. I think that also applies to Donald Trump's behavior on January 6th, which I think was atrocious. I listened to his speech live, and I got off and I said to my wife, he just incited a riot. If somebody had made a speech like that outside a courthouse to try to influence a court case, that would be impermissible. And I do understand that no one is above the law, and that's a phrase that is often repeated, particularly by Democrats when they want to put their political opponents in jail. But at the same time, that no one is above the law. One of the fundamental principles of law is what's called prosecutorial discretion, and that is the ability of those in office to make decisions, and that's because you can't really specify all details in a law. I give the example of, if your wife is having a baby or dying of appendicitis, and you're driving above the speed limit to get her to a hospital, and a police officer stops you, most police officers are wise enough to cut you a little slack in that kind of circumstance because of the potential consequences. That's called prosecutorial discretion or law enforcement discretion. And I don't believe that President Biden or Attorney General Merrick Garland is in a position where, like Pontius Pilate, they can wash their hands, say, oh, I'm not doing this, I'm giving it to a special counsel, I have nothing to do with it, so on. I think that's potentially dangerous. And I do think the key question is, do you really think, that's the one you asked, do you really think that we're that close to the precipice? I do. I'm scared. We've and one of the other factors I mentioned in the article, but I think it illustrates, the next Civil War, exactly. I think one of the key factors to bear in mind that I mentioned in the forthcoming article is, what about our international adversaries, and what about the potential for misinformation? I once had a top secret security clearance, and that was many years ago. So I'm pretty confident I won't be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for saying this. But we've known for a long time.
No secrets, please. Don't share any.
No secrets. But we've
nuclear
known
secrets. We don't want to hear them. No.
I'm not going to do any nuclear secrets.
Okay.
But it's
That's the other
well
show.
known that some of our international adversaries have hoped to stir up a race war in the United States for many, many years. And I think that if you try to put President Trump in jail, former President Trump in jail, you ought to think about the potential for how our international adversaries may try to exploit those divisions among Americans. And I do believe that January 6th was really bad day, but as my ex-wife was fond of saying, it can always get worse. And I do think that one can imagine how things could get a hell of a lot worse. And it's not that far away. I mean, we do have a situation in which one administration is refusing to enforce the immigration laws on the Mexican border, and the governor of Texas is sending armed agents of the state of Texas to drive back the
Mexican horde,
Mexican migrants or other migrants from countries all over the world. And I read just the other day that the governor of Texas had issued orders not to allow the state troopers to give water to people that were suffering from the extreme heat.
People have died from that already.
Yeah, and I mean, this is
Mexicans.
This is
Mexicans killed. if we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, this is not. We're not living in normal times, and I think we're so distracted by events in Ukraine that we are not being sensible. The other thing is, if you think about the Watergate era, the key thing there is when Barry Goldwater led a delegation of Republicans to Richard Nixon and told him, look, we're not going to be able to support you. And that led to Nixon's resignation.
Mhm.
So I think we have had events in American history which are profiled in John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. Most people haven't read it, I guess. But if you do read it, in almost every instance, the person who acted, who was profiled for his courage, took a career-ending action for the good of the country. That's what Kennedy called profiles in courage. So going back to your question about, well, wouldn't this hurt Biden politically? I mean, I just don't think that's the right test. I don't think one should be thinking about the political consequences, but preventing a situation in the country which is already bad from getting even worse.
Fair enough. Could I ask you about the Durham report? Have you heard about the Durham report?
Yeah, I've actually read most of the Durham report.
So my understanding is that it basically says it's a federal investigation, and it basically says Hillary Clinton took some campaign money. They bought this Steele dossier, fed it to the FBI as though it's facts. It wasn't really facts, and they kind of launched an investigation improperly from there, and then eventually got, I guess, the FBI, some intelligence communities, and the media to start saying Russia rigged the whole election and put Trump in, and that's not actually true. And there wasn't enough evidence to say that at the time. How would you characterize the report?
Well, I think that's a pretty accurate summary. I think that I'm not an expert in the internal workings of the FBI, and I don't know anything about the facts that are in the Durham report. But I do think I do think it was disappointing that it did not lead to more concern. I think this attempt to manipulate elections by circulating false reports about your opponent is the beginning of a downward spiral. And I think that this was during the Nixon era. This was called dirty tricks. And we were all horrified that this kind of thing went on. I think the fact that the Clinton campaign, not Hillary personally, but the Clinton campaign got away with it, and not only by I do think that those reports about Trump and the investigations and the suspicion that and the claims by Adam Schiff and others, I think they really undermined the first 2 years of the Trump presidency. So I think it's about more than the election. This didn't stop with the election. And Hillary Clinton never accepted the results of the 2016 election. She continues to maintain, as I understand it from news reports, that the election was stolen.
The Russian government gave it to Trump. She actually technically won. The Durham report says you rigged it. And then there's another study that came out around the same time saying that all the Russian rigging had no more than 1% effect on the entire electorate. And yet she's going around saying Russia rigged the whole election. And she's still doing it.
I don't know anything about that one way or the other, but I think it's indicative of how American politics has sunk to levels that were horrifying, even as recently as the Watergate era. I started in Washington as a law clerk during that period of time, And I think many of us saw the actions by the Nixon administration as a threat to our democracy. I think they pale in comparison to some of the things that we've seen more recently, and I think that weaponizing the prosecutorial aspects of our national government to go after your political opponents, whether you think you have a reasonable basis to do it or not, it just shouldn't be done. And I think that people should rise above the narrow considerations of the moment and think how history will regard them. And I think from a larger historical perspective, which is what we academics are supposed to bring to the party,
Right.
It's not a good thing to subject the country to a trial of Donald Trump, whether some people think he deserves it or not. And that's more or less what Gerald Ford said when he pardoned Nixon. He said, "I don't want to put the country through that trauma." And I think the trauma of trying Richard Nixon for the crimes during the Watergate era would have paled by comparison to what we're all going to go through if they go forward with these prosecutions. So I'm not defending what Trump did.
Of course.
But I do think that a criminal prosecution of the leading candidate of the opposition party should be beyond the pale, and people who are wise. I don't know Biden. I do know Merrick Garland, and I think highly of him. I think he's a wise man. I think people should really think seriously about whether or not the game is worth the candle, whether or not the conviction of Trump on these charges is really worth the damage that it will do to our country. That's my concern.
Yeah.
It's not defending what Trump did. It's saying, please let's think through what might happen. And I think, my background is in constitutional law, but also as an environmental lawyer. And one of the things that we often do in environmental law is we look not only at the most likely outcome, but we look at the potential worst case outcomes. I head of science at EPA, Paul Gilman, once said the purpose of risk assessment at EPA is to make sure that we never underestimate a risk to public health. And I think that same norm, that you've got to be concerned not just about the most likely outcome, but what is technically called the tails of the distribution. I've done a number of things in private practice where I showed people that the most likely outcome was not the one to worry about, that the expected value was really driven by huge adverse consequences that maybe had a 5 or even a 1% probability of coming about. And I think that's the way to look at this here. Before they executed Charles I of England, the King of England that was executed, one of the rebels said, "What if we are wrong?" And I think it's always important for people in public life to say, well, what if we are wrong? People are predicting that they can, convict Trump and it's going to have this effect or that effect on the next election. But I think they need to take into account, even if it's only a 1% probability, that this may tear the country apart. And I am actually worried that it will have really adverse effects. I think that now, I could be wrong. I'm often wrong. People might be sufficiently persuaded that by the evidence that comes out at trial and say, yeah, Trump deserves to be sent to prison and so on and so forth. I don't think that's likely to happen. I think people are so committed on both sides at this point. He is such a divisive character that I think that, there's an old expression that don't lie down with the dog or you'll get fleas.
Yeah.
And
Yes, there is.
and I think a trial of Donald Trump is exactly the worst thing for the country and for Biden. We ought to move on. And I wrote an article in the American Spectator urging Trump to step down and arguing that he would be a more significant figure historically if he did not run. He obviously did not take my advice, and frankly, I don't expect Biden to take my advice either. Although I would be very pleased if he did. Um, but I do think that this upcoming trial of Donald Trump on multiple charges is only going to drive people deeper into their corners, and
I can see that.
I don't think that's good for the country. I think we need to find ways to come together, not to get further apart.
We're winding down. I got two last questions for you, and I want to say thank you for coming out and thank you for making this statement. I I believe you, and I've kind of have a similar opinion, and I don't think enough people are raising the warning flag, especially here in California. The attitude is once he goes to jail, we've proven that law and justice still exist in America, and everything's going to be super mega awesome and righteous, and everybody's going to love it and realize how bad a guy he is. And I'm like, just like they did with the first impeachment trial, or the second, or the third, or the fifth trial. I mean, like, it never changes anything. They don't want to hear that. So, let me ask you: is there a point where people can become? I think what you're saying is that people can experience too much shock. This country's already been through a lot of shock. You prosecute Trump, it's going to be too much shock, and we're going to be so shocked and so upset, you won't be able to calm us down again. Is that roughly correct?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about it that way. I was really just thinking about what I thought the likely responses and counter responses would be. I do think that you make a good point. You might think about this as uh, the potential that people will be traumatized, and I think an awful lot of people will be turned off by politics. I think that if if these trials go forward, I don't think it's going to change anybody's mind, and I think a lot of people are really going to be turned off by politics and feel that the system is rigged. And I can't imagine that the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, or people like them, will lightly accept Donald Trump being sent to prison. Uh, another possibility is if we have a trial and he's convicted. Another thing that I've thought about is I think judges would be wise to give him a suspended sentence rather than send him to prison. I think if he is actually sent to federal prison, that he'll be a hero, and people around the world. I mean, most Americans probably don't pay as much attention to events around the world as they should, but sending an opposition figure to prison uh, is a way to make them into a great hero to their supporters. That happened with Gandhi. It's happened throughout the world. So I think your friends in California who are thinking that the trial is going to be a vindication and the ultimate comeuppance for Donald Trump, they may be wrong. They may be, despite the what comes out at trial. I think there are many people, because of the history that you've outlined, that will not believe that the conviction of Trump was motivated by anything other than politics, no matter what kind of evidence comes out. And that will only undermine respect for law and the judicial system in the United States. So it's time for somebody, either Biden or some of the judges or Merrick Garland. It's time for somebody to rise above the debates of the moment and look at this in a larger historical perspective. That's my point.
we have to leave it there. I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor. Thank you for taking the time to explain this to us. And thank you for the article. This article is coming out soon. We can look for this.
I hope so. Yeah, I expect it'll be out in a few. I'm just in the process of submitting it today, but I anticipate that it'll be out in a couple of days in the American Spectator.
So watch for the American Spectator, watch for this, and we want to say thank you for coming out, Professor. I will email you a copy of the video in a few hours, and I want to say thank you very much for spending time with us, answering questions, and imagining how much worse it could get in America and giving us a warning.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Professor.